So yeah, hi everybody, and welcome to our penultimate Narrative, Culture and Community Research Centre seminar. I'm really happy to welcome Dr. Lyle Skains to talk to us this afternoon from the Health and Science Communication Lecturer at Bournemouth University. And Lyle researches interactive digital narratives for health and science communication. And that includes exciting things like practice-based research into writing, reading and playing, and publishing digital and transmedia narratives, and of course scholarly books as well. So I was just looking at your recent digital fiction, like the No World for Tomorrow for the U and CO2 project, and Only Always Never for the Infectious Storytelling project, and your latest book, Using Interactive Digital Narrative for Health and Science Education, which talks more about these projects. And you can find out more about Lyle's work at lyleskains.com. So I will just hand straight over to you if that's okay, and
Great.
we will come back for questions at the end. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I do have slides, my apologies. I'm going to go ahead and share and find those wherever they are. Yay.
Perfect.
Okay. Great. So yeah, so this is me. And the slides, you can find them at this link, so that if anybody wants to follow along or needs references or anything like that, uh, feel free to go and grab them. So there we go. So big plug for the book that this came out in May, using interactive digital narrative in science and health education. It very much is what it says on the tin. It does talk about the two projects, UNCO2 and infectious storytelling, as well as chapters on sort of the practice-based approach to creating these works, which is mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. Excuse me. And also what it means to work in interdisciplinary teams, because quite often these projects require people both from sciences and the arts, and there's lots of considerations there across disciplines and dialects and dialogues and research methods and things like that that we had to approach, and so we've got some insights there as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about playable comms. I'm going to focus mostly on the infectious storytelling project, just because it has some nice examples, and it has some good challenges that I can talk about. And initially I'm going to talk about the Transform project, which was kind of how I got into this kind of stuff. I'm going to talk about edutainment a little bit, and I put edutainment in quotation marks because I don't actually like edutainment. I think it is chocolate covered broccoli. It is we're going to put this education for you into a package that you're supposed to like, and then we're going to shove it down your throat regardless of whether you like it or not. And most audiences can see through this, and they're resistant to it because of that. And so my approach is entertainment as education as opposed to edutainment. And I'm going to talk a lot about writing to educational spec and the challenges and benefits of writing these works for specific audiences for specific purposes, and what is entailed in all of that. So the notion of entertainment as education, and that's the complete foundation of my playable comms effort, as it were, in using interactive digital narratives for health and science comm, is that it's speaking to people on a different level than formal education. So formal education, we spend, maybe if you do some rough but back of the napkin calculations, we spend about 3% of our lives in formal education settings. A little bit more if you're like us and you've gone through and you got a PhD and you do all of that. A little bit less if you're the average person and you maybe leave school at GCSEs or after high school or what have you. We spend about almost a third of our lives, about 33%, a little less, engaging in some form of media. So that's everything from reading books, interacting with social media, what film, TV, playing games, anything that we do that is mediated counts there. And so it means that we're getting a lot of our information, much of our education, and what we know about the world and how we connect to it. We're getting that through media and not through formal education. And we know that media teaches people things, whether for good or bad, or whether they're accurate or not. We see this in a good way in people who, say, learn CPR from watching television programs, and then they perform CPR even though they've never been to a CPR course, and are able to save a friend or stranger, or what have you. And that is a phenomenon that happens over and over. And also, media can have a very poor effect on education if the information is inaccurate or is seen as coming from an untrustworthy source, as we see in social media. And social media has, I'm not going to talk a lot about social media, it has a very special role in some very bad information sharing, as we know, but that's kind of outside the scope. Uh, I've I was initially a scientist in my education career, so I'm one of those people who've done a little bit more than 3% of my life in education. Um, and I was an evolutionary biologist. And so I love the overlap of narrative with evolution. And narrative is one of the evolutionary effects of being human, essentially. Um, we evolved, we're very social, we have a very complex social structure, humans do, and narrative is a big factor in how we understand our social hierarchy, how we understand our relations to other people, how we negotiate in that society, and it's also how we predict behavior. We don't have to see all kinds of behavior and events in order to understand them. I don't have to have my own parent, for example, die to know that that is a very sad event and I don't want it to happen, because of stories and narratives and things like that. And so we use it to predict other behavior and to sort of judge other people, which is why gossip is actually another very big tool in social behavior. But narrative is important. It's how we learn, it's how we understand the world, it's how we communicate with one another. And this is going back to the development of language. And so it sort of is a quintessential way of delivering information and reaching people. And yet, in terms of science communication, it's largely been ignored. Science communication has been predicated almost entirely upon scientists learning how to dumb down their science for the lay person. So if you could just make science understandable for everyone, they will get it. Well, we know that's not true. As we can see in just the last year, with the number of people who refuse to wear masks or refuse to get vaccinated, it's not enough to just say, okay, science good, follow science. And also, narrative is very good for word of mouth and saturation. We don't all have access to massive media properties like soap operas or big films that can communicate science and health topics. So using narrative, finding something that people will share with one another and that they will talk about, is a good way to get a spreadable message in the parlance of Henry Jenkins. Um, so the first project where I came to this is was on the Transform project, and this was a project led by Astrid Enslin, who was my PhD supervisor at the time. That she was working with bibliotherapy and expressive writing through interactive digital narrative for teens with body image issues. And so what I did on this project was we had a 2-week summer camp for teens. I was paired with a psychologist who led the group through some interventions and exercises exercises, having them work through some of their discuss body image issues, talk about their feelings and experiences, that sort of thing. And then I would help them to create their own interactive digital narratives about their experiences or based on their experiences. And so it was this sort of healing through reading text and writing text, and specifically looking at these interactive narratives. Um, let me use my arrow. So one of the texts we used was My Body of Wunderkammer from Shelley Jackson. You can see on the left here, her body is how you navigate through the piece, and it's a memoir-based piece. And when you click on areas of the body, it then tells you get this lexia of text that she's sharing feelings and emotions and experiences based on what you've clicked on. And so it's a very embodied experience and very much focused on these issues. Not specifically created for this purpose, but we explored in terms of whether teens reading this, it would help them or not, or help them discuss these issues. This is a piece we didn't actually use on the project because it came out sort of simultaneously, and so we weren't aware of it at the time. This is images of reader experiences from With Those We Love Alive from Porpentine, and the story asks the reader to draw these sigils on their body as they go through reading it, and the theme of the text is the body and trauma and self-harm. And so it's a physicalization of the experience, and it's that interactivity and participation that is very effective for the readers. And we can see how well they connect to it through their social media reports. One that we did use on the Transform project, and that was probably the most effective in terms of bibliotherapy, was Fitting the Pattern from Christine Wilkes. I don't think this is available. It's a Flash piece, and I don't think it's been updated post Flash. Hopefully it will be because it's a fantastic narrative. It's a memoir piece about growing up with a mother who's a seamstress, and so you can see from this particular shot that it's this notion of viewing her body in a certain way because she thought that her body needed to be changed to perfectly fit into clothes. Her mother would always make her clothes a size smaller than she actually was to force her to fit into these clothes. And so it's a very interesting piece, and it's very accessible in terms of these themes. So I'm going to talk about infectious storytelling, and there's a link there to the current version of it, which has been through beta testing and through one set of focus groups. It has not been updated and revised since those focus groups, however, so this is still a testing model. It is meant to be experienced on a mobile device, but it is accessible on a laptop. Feel free to run through it and have a look at it and experience it. It is there. That's the sort of sharing sample link. So the process of infectious storytelling, and this is where the interdisciplinarity comes in. We met on this project as part of a research leadership program called the Crucible. This was in Wales when it's for researchers in Wales. They pull 30 people a year into these residential programs, and basically they mush you together and apply some pressure and see if new projects and new ideas come out of it. So we found we had a common interest in antimicrobial resistance and some of the effects that has on our current understanding of the world and infectious disease and health. And so it was a microbiologist, a film studies scholar, a romanticist, and me sitting down and going, we're all interested in this topic. How can we work together? And so we came up with an idea, which was we want to affect people's behavior around antimicrobial resistance. We wanted to change antibiotic seeking behavior. There are many factors that lead to antibiotic resistance. Um, and the science side of the things are what the microbiologist was working on. But how could we make some measure of a change in terms of behavior in targeted populations? So in this area, they identify a couple of different key audiences, and they call them the three Ps, which is prescribers, doctors, healthcare workers, veterinarians who prescribe antibiotics, um, the public, people who get antibiotics or use them in, say livestock populations, as well as policymakers. And so we're looking at the public here, at patients specifically, and how do we change antibiotic seeking behavior? So you get a cold, you get the flu, and you go to the doctor and say, I want an antibiotic. I don't feel well. Give me an antibiotic. I don't care if it's going to work or not. Give me an antibiotic. And this actually is a significant issue in that's been identified in the NHS is doctors are overworked and a patient comes in and is just insistent that they need an antibiotic. And so just to get the patient out of the room, they'll give them a prescription for antibiotics, which is that's another thing. You need to talk to prescribers not to do that, but we want to look at initially in this first iteration at patients who are seeking this. So the considerations here are that we want that behavior change. We want them to stop doing this, to listen to their doctor when they say what they need. We wanted to embed a mnemonic for this, so that even if they don't remember everything about antibiotics and how they work or don't work, that they would have something that would help them in terms of their behavior. Our audience is adults in the British system, specifically people with the ability to make medical decisions for themselves or others. So adults, parents, caregivers. The context is waiting areas. We were thinking about waiting areas in GP surgeries, hospital waiting areas, chemists, this sort of thing. The NHS says that the average length of waiting time in such areas is 5 to 10 minutes. My personal experience does not coincide with such a short time, but we took them at their word and said, okay, 5 to 10 minutes. The nice thing about interactive digital narratives is that they are replayable, and so if you have a much longer wait, you can replay them and enjoy the replay in the longer wait. Thinking about the context of where patients would be experiencing these stories, we said they're going to be looking at them on a mobile device. Nobody's bringing their laptop into a doctor's appointment. And they're going to have an iffy data connection. It's going to be the cheap, poor Wi-Fi that's freely available now in hospitals and waiting areas, or it's going to be over their data connection. So we can't assume that they're going to want to download lots of graphics and things like that. So the challenges in creating an interactive digital narrative for this purpose, the first is the unfamiliarity. We're looking at mainstream audiences. We're not looking at people who are largely familiar. Apologies, my dog's in the background. One is trying to get the other to play with him. Is the unfamiliarity that people have with these types of narratives. They're not in the mainstream yet. There are certain types of narratives that if you're a gamer, you might be familiar with, or if you're very tech connected, you might be familiar with. People are familiar with hypertext in terms of hyperlinks and the web, but they may not have experienced a particular narrative this way. So the idea is to keep the novelty to a minimum. You don't want people to trip over the technology and the unfamiliarity with it so that they don't get the message you're trying to have them get, that you don't want them to be so confused by what is going on with the narrative and the text. He's a puppy. Apologies. The limited time is also an issue in terms of this notion of entertainment as education. One of the key elements in how narratives work as persuasive communication to affect positive behavior change is that there's an emotional connection. And if you've only got 5 minutes to tell a story, it's pretty difficult to develop an emotional connection. On the UNCO2 project, we had closer to 15 minutes for one run through of the story, but 40 minutes to an hour for the workshop reading of the story. And so there's a lot more time to develop a connection to the characters. And we used a personalization effect in that they could input their names and the names of their friends as characters. And so the story was more about them. For this short a piece and the limitations in terms of the devices and connectivity and that sort of thing, we needed to think about creating a story that with characters they already knew. So one of the ways to do that is to use a known folk tale, a known story that they're already emotionally connected to, and so you can just hit the ground running in that limited time. As I mentioned, limited data limits the graphics, no sound. Nobody likes hearing somebody playing something with sound in waiting areas, so no sound whatsoever. We knew that it was going to be varying devices of different capabilities, different sizes, that sort of thing. So wanted it to be simple and web enabled and adaptable. We've got a wide audience here. It needs to be accessible in terms of reading level and the narrative and that sort of thing. So nothing that's highly technical or anything like that. And we are asking for some change. So we want the reader to feel that that change is doable, that they can accomplish that. Asking for small changes is what we're trying to do. So it's not know everything about antibiotics and become a champion of the cause. It's no, just, simple listen to your doctor when they tell you something. And then the mnemonic that I built in is because this is a small project, we don't have that broad audience. This isn't the WHO building this or Public Health England. This is a small group. How could we make it so that we could connect to those a little bit? So what we did was I took language from an existing WHO campaign. So the only, always, never comes from a 2016 antimicrobial resistance campaign from the WHO. So it's going to be echoed in other things. And so it's going to help that message to be communicated to the readers. So out of these limitations comes creativity, which is a really pithy saying that doesn't account for at all the number of times you just want to throw the whole project out the window because you can't figure out how it all comes together. And I wanted to sort of make this apparent. These are the 16 handwritten pages of notes over multiple days that I wrote trying to come up with the story for this. It is hard. Especially if you're creating narratives, you're a writer, you're a creator, and you're used to just a story occurring to you or a character, and you kind of sit down, maybe you have a plot and you figure out where it's going to go and how it's going to work. You're not thinking about audience, you're not thinking about how they're going to read it. Maybe you're thinking about the platform or how you want it to look, whether it's a screenplay or a short story or a game. But all of these limitations and considerations and purposes aren't there in that purely creative project. For this one, they are, and that places a lot of constraints that actually can hamper the creative process quite a lot. And so this is me doing concept diagrams and trying to link up characters and themes and ideas and settings and communication and trying to develop the mnemonic. I'm not a very good poet. And so I wanted a mnemonic that would work within the story world. I did choose, I think I sort of subconsciously chose Oz and the Wizard of Oz stories because it's one of my favorites. The other added benefit is that it's in public domain. I can do anything I want with it. I can use the original illustrations. I can use lots of things that remind people of the story and engender that emotional connection. We did select, and this was again probably another subconscious decision on my part. I'm a big hobby reader in infectious disease and pandemics, so this past year has been very surreal for me. But I looked around the group and saw a microbiologist, a romanicist, a film scholar, and said actually TB hits all of our areas, and so we can all have something unique to look at and contribute. Um, so decided to use that as a case study in The Wizard of Oz. So what happens if TB hits Oz and somebody goes, "Oh, it's okay. We've developed antibiotics in the other world, the actual world, whatever it is. I'll bring antibiotics here and I'll save Oz." Well, very quickly, Oz develops antimicrobial resistance, and uh, they now have TB rampant everywhere. It's nice because it also includes agricultural populations. There's a lot of farming in Oz, in the Oz stories, and so it works for different categories of our audience. And so developing that story sort of started to develop through lots of different brainstorming sessions and developing this sort of thing. So it's linking it to folktale, linking and some of the folk tales that I discovered about tuberculosis. It was linked to vampirism in New England in sort of the Puritan days of old, and so linking some of those stories in and that sort of thing was really really fun and interesting for me. We were able to link some John Keats in a little bit in terms of a romantic poet, and to develop some of the text and magic spells and things like that that were in the story. This is the uh, backside, as it were, of the text itself of Only Always Never. This is created in Twine, which is I use it a lot. But the nice thing about Twine is that it outputs directly. Its main output is an HTML file. It's very light, and it's already mobile enabled for the most part. So it made that process very simple and easy to do. You can see here the narrative structure is not very innovative or complex. It's primarily linear. You can see where you start off, you're definitely going to go through a linear story, and there are just some sort of cycles that the reader goes through and has some choices about how they go through their journey, that wind up with either they either save Oz entirely or they don't, but they're going to get the same messages no matter what. And so this is keeping the novelty to a minimum. They're still getting a narrative in a form that they understand and that will be satisfying by the end. But they're getting the benefits of being able to make their own choices and explore a little bit through some of these cyclical narrative structures. So these are some screenshots from the text from Only Always Never. They get different backgrounds depending on whether they're in Oz or they're in the actual world. You can see that the mnemonic repeats. It's the title of the story. It repeats. It's in bold. It's in different colors. It gets underlined. We're not being subtle here. We definitely want them to walk away remembering Only Always Never, because that's the mnemonic that we drew from the WHO, and they do actually see a WHO poster in the final sequence. And so I developed this into a magic spell that the reader has to the player character has to find, and they have to find an object and the spell and then use that to save Oz. And so this is a sort of an Oz reimagining of the WHO message, which is only use antibiotics as prescribed, always follow your doctor's orders, and never loan your medication to someone else or save it for later. Take your whole medication. I can't remember exactly what it is because Only Always Never sticks in there, and so I remember the gist. So this is the idea. And you can see there's some Keats here. The Tin Man turns out to be quite a poet, and steals things from Keats. So this is the type of story that they're seeing, and the type of links that they're seeing in the text, and some of the pieces that went into it. So again, the book is the main publication for the Infectious Storytelling Project. It also includes elements of it also includes the stuff on UNCO2, which is a whole other project with other constraints that we've done. The approaches to using interactive digital narrative in for science and health communication, there's a lot that goes into it. And there are different methods and approaches to using it. So on the Transform project and on UNCO2 and on infectious storytelling, we're using bibliotherapy. This idea that reading can affect attitude and behavior through experiencing these IDNs. On UNCO2, we're actually using expressive writing as well, because UNCO2 is a series of 3 workshops that we teach to secondary school students. The first workshop is on climate change and their carbon footprints, and how the chemistry of that works, and doing the math of their carbon footprint and some carbon trading. They read the text that we created for the bibliotherapy portion as the second workshop. And then in the third workshop, they create their own interactive digital narrative. And I really love integrating that wherever possible, because it's just it gives even more agency and more expression to these narratives. And so they can explore these things from that creator perspective. The interactivity, and this is something that we're still pushing to examine, and I still and part of the project that I'm currently seeking funding for, and doing in smaller ways before the funding comes in, is to examine what effect the interactivity actually has on these messaging. Part of the problem with all of these sorts of campaigns and communications is there's very little that's done to actually examine whether or not they're effective. The WHO never does any sort of measurement as to whether their campaigns work. Uh, Public Health England has its Antibiotic Guardian campaign, where they say, oh, 300,000 people have signed up to be antibiotic guardians, and they have pledged to fight antimicrobial resistance. Um, but they're mostly healthcare workers who kind of already know about the issue, and it's a little bit preaching to the choir, and we still don't even know if that's effective, because there's no measures being taken. And so it's very difficult to know, yes, these things work. We just kind of assume that they do. And so on that level, we don't have measures that existing things work, much less whether interactivity will make a difference. But our theory is that the interactivity gives a level of agency and personalization that connects the story on a deeper level, on multiple cognitive levels. And then also the repetition of stories, because of that interactivity, keeps the embeds the message further. Your normal linear narratives that are experienced once, they're going to get that message through, but then they're not going to go back to the start and start it all over again. Whereas in games and interactive narratives, they're more likely to go back to the start and go, oh, I want to see what happens if I make different choices. And we encourage that, because part of it is, okay, if you make poor choices, you will get a poor outcome. And so we want that interactivity to express that. And so that's one of the theories, is that interactivity can enhance some of these messages. Embedding folklore and familiar stories, and thinking about folklore as more than just, your Grimm's fairy tales and things like that, but urban myths and popular narratives and things that are used frequently in public domain and things like that. If you can embed those in, it's a localization, and helps to embed it in the culture of the reader, as well as to connect them emotionally to it. Personalization is also very helpful. As I said, with UNCO2, we were able to let the readers enter their own names, the names of their friends and family in for the characters. And so as they read the story, they're getting text messages from their friends, and they're talking to their friends, and they're going over to the friends' houses and maybe having a little romance with certain someone, and that sort of thing. So it very much feels like it's part of their story. In terms of the multiliteracies, it's engaging things on different levels, but it's also allowing science and arts and technology all to be sort of bundled together, and that's a main focus of a lot of new curricula um, for school children aged kids. As we look at educational programs. A lot of the government bodies are looking for integrated programs like this, which is we built UNCO2 specifically for that purpose, in the way that we did, because it's combining different subjects rather than pulling them all apart into different silos. In terms of writing these, Charlie, sorry, my puppy's ridiculous. In terms of writing these, um, they're, as I said, writing them on this sort of educational spec with these contexts and requirements definitely does uh, put some constraints on the work, but also sort of make it more creative. I know that it is hard to create these; it is difficult, but in the end, I think creating them with that eye toward having a really good narrative is worth it in the end. But it is affected by the purpose of the narrative, by what you want the narrative to do and how to achieve that, even down to the emotions that you're trying to inspire, because there's this very thin line in some of these topics, like climate change and antimicrobial resistance, where it could very easily become hopeless, where you feel like nothing you do, there's no point to it, so why should you do anything? And so you're walking that line between fear and hope in terms of the emotional effects. The topic, suiting it to the audience. And this is actually something that we found is a little bit difficult with UNCO2, because we were able to analyze the text that the students wrote in response to the program, and their IDNs on climate change. We could see that some students weren't taking the messages on board, because of different cultural expectations and cultural experiences that are different, in their home environment than from their school environment. And so what we aimed this at school environments, because that's the information that we had. But in on an individual level, it can be very difficult, because they may see things a different way or have different values and different habitus, in terms of their home and culture. And so localization is a very difficult and complex measure, and practice to be able to reach these audiences. The context matters, like I say, in terms of where they're going to be experiencing these texts. We even found this on UNCO2. We expected the schools to have a computer lab, where the students would go through the workshop, and it wouldn't be a problem. And it was a massive problem. Lots of schools do not have computer labs, or they only have tablet devices. And then, of course, with the pandemic, the students were at home, and we found that so many students did not have access to a computer at all. They could only do things on a mobile device. These are all things that we didn't anticipate initially, and we've had to adjust to. So these are definite things that affect the communication that you wouldn't have thought about just creating a your normal creative process in terms of creating narrative. So those challenges are in terms of accessibility, not just in terms of able-bodiedness, but in terms of reading ability, in terms of devices, in terms of the context, in terms of data and wireless communication. All these sorts of things have an effect on the work. The literacy of the audience, their familiarity with the type of text, with IDNs, and whether they're resistant to the technology or resistant to the message because of either their experience or their culture in some way. and incorporating with existing messages without competing. If there are existing messages out there that are good messages, that maybe just aren't getting through or aren't proliferating, can you make them in such a way that they will echo and repeat and enhance the message that you're trying to give rather than cancel out? Oop, that went too far. Nope. Go back. So the benefits, we've had really enthusiastic responses from communicators and educators. Um, People are really loving these, educators in particular, I think, because it gives them a nice package where, in terms of the UNCO2 project, it gives them a package that they can set in their classrooms, because we did it that way on purpose. Communicators are loving it because definitely in science communication, we're hitting a wall, and we're seeing that wall happen in terms of anti-vaccination movement and anti-climate change movements, or even just climate disbelief sort of things. And so anything that gets people on board in a new way will be well received. It does develop digital skills and literacy and aids in some of these curricula goals. And it's this interdisciplinary merging of arts and science that is very exciting these days. It's exciting for the funding bodies, even though they don't yet really know what it means. But hopefully we'll get them there. Um, and in terms of efficacy, we are looking for a larger study for these quantitative measures to see how effective IDNs in general are, and then different aspects of narrative and topics and audience, being able to compare them across different projects. So that's the project that we're looking at in the future, is the Sustainable Storytelling Lab. Um, Looking at using prose, comics, interactive digital narratives, games, immersive stories, film, different aspects of narrative storytelling, to see what works for these topics, contexts, and audiences. And that is me. That's all the references. Again, the slides are available on that bit.ly link. And I'm available on Twitter and email. And I think Playable Comms is probably the best resource for having a look at some of these different projects. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lyle. That was fantastic. As you say, like a really timely kind of way to start looking at these sorts of things, as we kind of see more and more resistance. So yeah, I can totally see tons of value in all of that, and loads of really interesting information on what sorts of stories you can kind of adapt into this as well. Does anyone have any questions? As well as being available on Twitter, you're available for the next 15 minutes to answer our questions about this. I can't see the chat, sorry, for a second. I have too many screens open, but actually no one's popped anything in there. But I don't know if anyone, no, great. I don't know if anyone has any questions they'd like to kind of ask. Go, Francis.
Just a quick one. That's a really interesting project, and I can see it kind of going off in all kinds of directions. So it was really great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Lyle. But I wondered, you mentioned that one of the things that was really important was the satisfaction of the story. And I wondered how that was judged. So what criteria you were using to judge that the experience itself as a story was felt to be a good one.
So we in UNCO2 we do teach the workshops ourselves, and so we work through the story with the kids. So we are able to observe the kids as they read the story and hear their reactions and what they want to do. And part of the lesson plan is to is a little challenge for them. There are essentially 6 different endings, but they have various iterations. So I think there's something more like 18 to 24 different endings, and so we kind of challenge them, find as many endings as you can. But I think and with Only Always Never, it's the same thing. They do get to an ending, and they can definitely tell it is ended. they can restart. And with a lot of interactive digital narrative, with a lot of electronic literature, it's very experimental. And one of the things in terms of looking at these narratives theoretically, and Marie Law Ryan has talked about this, is whether in terms of digital fiction and digital narratives, whether the notion of denouement has been sort of discarded. Do we never really get to an end? And with these particular texts, as the writer, I was very aware of this. We also ran a previous study on the Reading Digital Fiction Project with a piece that I wrote for this study, examining how readers react to different types of hyperlinks. And I know that Jim has done work in this area as well. So we're building on that. And what we found is that readers are, even in these sorts of environments, they're reading for the plot. They're reading to advance the story. We put in these aesthetic links and these poetic links, and we, they're very artistic and all that. And readers just go, I don't know. We found that anytime a reader clicked one of those links, it was for a completely random reason. It would be like, oh, I clicked on that because I had an ex-girlfriend once who was into that kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, that's, that's, and it made sense. And they click on those far less often than anything, and it was always for a random reason. And so they're, especially if they're unfamiliar with these types of texts, they're still really looking for narrative, and they're looking for it to have that structure in this culture where we're familiar with that sort of narrative arc. It'd be really interesting to try these in different cultures that have more episodic type narratives, in terms of indigenous narratives and things like that. So I was conscious of deliberately putting in an endpoint where it felt like they got to an end, they could go back and try to do it again and find something different, but where they definitely knew, oh, I got to this point. And so you could see the kids comparing with one another. Did you get this one? I got this one. That's that sort of Oregon Trail experience from my childhood. And then with the focus groups on infectious storytelling, we could actually talk directly to the group and ask them about it.
That's great. Thanks, Lyle.
Yeah.
Yeah, Trevor, go.
Yeah, hi Lyle. I really enjoyed
Hi,
your talk again. Hi, good to see you again. And we share a lot of interests as overlap there, I think. I'm interested in attention span and different age groups, and also wondering about whether there are three questions there, I suppose. One is around attention span and how you measure that and understand that in terms of the users. The second question, I think, is probably around how must it always be text led, do you think, in terms of your thinking about it? And I think the third point really is it also very age dependent in terms of how you're targeting your audiences?
In terms of attention span, I did a sort of a little study during my PhD, because I was interested in this too, in terms of, they say when you're writing a screenplay, you got to have the inciting incident by page 15, right? Screenwriting is so horrendously formulaic, at least in terms of the big studio type stuff, and then there's television episodic structuring that does it in a certain way. You got to have the hook and all this sort of stuff, and and then there's novels, which is like, oh, the first 3 chapters really have to, so there's all these rules, right? And so I was like, okay, we have, basically, because of the way our media has been shaped, we have expectations. And so I was interested in what expectations people would bring to this sort of medium. And my little informal study that I did and never published was that just out of the blue, they don't know anything about the story. It's not a story that they've sought out. It averages about 7 minutes. This was with college age students. So 7 minutes was about where the novelty of the interactive digital narrative would hold them. And then if they didn't have something else there, the narrative itself, if they weren't interested in it, they'd sort of start to flag. Which is interesting because it's sort of in between like feature film attention span. It's not quite as long as a novel. It's not as short as a game. I think a game you get a couple of cutscenes, but then people want to get into it, right? You hear all about wanting to skip through cutscenes. So I think you've got a limited amount of time in which the novelty of the thing will attract them, and then you have to have a good narrative in whatever it is. So yeah, so that's a definite issue. And also the context matters, if you're in an emergency room waiting area and there's lots of stuff going on, are you going to sit, I don't know, but, there's always TVs in there, but I also know that as many times as I've been to an emergency room, I'm bored as heck and I'll read anything in there and experience, that sort of thing. So it is an interesting question, those attention spans. We found that, and the nice thing about the interactive digital narratives is even the UNCO2 one, which is longer, it one read through, if it's just a single person reading, is usually about 10 to 15 minutes. So it's more short story length than it is feature film or novel or anything like that. But it's replayable. So if they actually do like it, they could spend a lot more time with it. And we actually found that they do. And so that's an interesting aspect of the replayability. In terms of the text-based, no, definitely don't always have to be text-based. And I think that that's one thing that we want to examine with the Sustainable Storytelling Lab, is to look at film and look at graphics in terms of comics, because what they call graphic medicine, comics are used a lot in healthcare communication and training and that sort of thing. And so that is, we want to examine the effects of those as well, because visuals are really important. This particular one and these particular pieces use a lot of visuals because, like I say, the context is that they're, whether it's an educational context or that the more visuals you had, the heavier the piece was going to be for them to download. But no, I think visual storytelling is crucial, absolutely crucial. I mean, my background is as a prose storyteller. So whatever I do, it's going to be bound, I like writing things. But definitely I think that these same things can be achieved in different media, and that's what we want to examine. What was the
third question really was about being age specific and whether this really is lending itself mostly to younger people rather than my mother, for instance.
Actually, my mom enjoys them. And it's one of those things, is I do use my mother as a springboard, because every time I'm home, I have to teach her how to copy and paste all over again. So not a tech person. And like I say, the infectious storytelling is aimed at adults, but because it's very wide, it is the sort of, that it's not an adulty story. It's been really interesting to me to get the adults' responses in the focus groups, and in, even in the beta testing with my co-investigators, because even my co-investigators weren't familiar with these works. And so in beta testing, they read them, and their responses, they're like, they're really excited by them, they really like them. And they just think it's so cool, and why don't we see more of these? And I'm actually writing a whole book right now on why we haven't seen more of these. But I think that it's something that doesn't necessarily restricted. I think that we think of them as more for kids because it's games, but games are, I think it's something of a cultural myth that games are mostly predominate with younger age groups, because definitely they're enjoyed across all genders, cultures, and ages. So I'm not necessarily anticipating age being an issue to experiencing these. Just finding creative ways to encourage whatever audience it is to interact with it.
That's great. Many thanks.
Yeah.
I think we got time for one more question, if anybody has one.
It was just that informative of a presentation.
Chair's privilege, and I can ask a question. I always have questions. Actually, since you talked about graphic medicine and comics at the end, I think I wanted to ask a bit more about that. I don't know if you've got a clear idea of how you're going to use the comics or what kind of strengths they might bring to the future projects, if there's any more you wanted to say about it. But one thing I was thinking from the PhD students I've supervised who've worked on graphic medicine was the potential of those narratives to sort of decenter the kind of medical point of view as well, and really empower kind of illness narratives and the experiences of patients and the voices, which kind of seems to speak to the first example you talked about, that body image kind of example as well. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know where your plans are headed with graphic medicine, if you've got any more to say about that, but
Absolutely,
I'd be really interested.
And Anna Feigenbaum is on the project with me, and so we're looking a lot at graphics, and I love all that stuff, and I really love web comics. I think web comics are one of the key areas where these things are familiar to people, because the digital web comics and some of the interactive things that they do, people have just gone, cool, great, which is nice, as opposed to literature where they've gone, no. And so yeah, so we want to do some comparisons. The nice thing about the graphics is that they don't rely on the digital interface, so they can be printed, used as posters, used as leaflets, that sort of thing. So there are definite benefits in terms of contexts and audiences there. And then the difference, the personalization, and that's also very important to us, is to get that patient perspective and the ability of patients to be able to put their own stories into them. So sometimes the text really helps with that, to have text-based narratives or the interactive narratives, because they don't have to be able to draw or feel like he's drawing. I can tell, I just started drawing myself, and so I know like the fear and the insecurities that go along with that. But sometimes if you can just put things in words, it helps. And then to have the ability to do it the other way around helps as well for people who are more visually oriented. But yeah, we plan to do some comparisons. What we'd love to be able to do is have one narrative in prose, in a comic form, in an interactive digital narrative, maybe be able to compare how they work, and so we can start to pull apart what elements of them work for different purposes and different audiences and different contexts.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to allow one more question from Bronwyn before we wrap up.
Yeah, sorry for the late hand, but it's not really. I was going to ask a question about ethics, but that would be really stinker at the end of the session, so I'm not going to ask that. I was just going to ask Lyle, just for people who may not know about the Sustainable Storytelling Lab, especially people at BU, just maybe if you could say a few words about that and how they can get involved if they want to.
Yeah, so I'm preparing a funding bid right now to essentially do what I just said, which is to create narratives. So we have specific topics that people have brought to the project, and things they want to explore. And it's everything from interactive digital narratives, comic, graphic medicine, documentary filmmaking, soundscapes, that's the word, and locative storytelling, lots of different things, and looking at different ways to deliver science and health communication, and see how behavior changes, how we can use these narratives to change behavior, and how effective they are. So we're setting up a sort of a methods protocol of, gather a team that, with a subject matter expert and researchers and practitioners who can create the narrative. And we're trying to share people amongst teams to set up these actual empirical examinations, to be able to test the narratives, do surveys before and after, and then a bit longer term to measure attitudes and possible behavior change. And so I'm preparing that proposal right now. If you go to playablecomms.org, there's a description of the Sustainable Storytelling Lab under projects. And so there's just a better description than the one I just gave off the top of my head. I really need to get better at my spiel. and you know, just contact me, you know, get in touch with me. I'm on Bournemouth email, and internal people, external people. We're involved with a couple of different institutions in the UK, one in Brazil, and so it's, you know, the more the merrier at this point.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm glad I allowed that question. That's great. Thank you so much, Lyle. I'm going to stop recording now, for this marks the end.